Good day, class. So for today's episode, we're going to discuss the inverse, converse, and contrapositive of an if-then statement. So we can define the converse, contrapositive, and the inverse of a conditional statement. We start with the conditional statement if P then Q, where P denotes us the hypothesis, then Q denotes us the conclusion. So our converse of this conditional statement is if Q then P, followed by contrapositive conditional statement is if not Q then not P, then inverse if not P then not Q. So we will see how these statements work with an example. Suppose we start with the conditional statement if it rained last night then the sidewalk is wet, where P here is it rained last night and Q is the sidewalk is wet. So let us identify here the converse, contrapositive, and the inverse of the conditional statement. So let us start first with the converse of the conditional statement. So our converse is if Q then P. So our conditional statement is if the sidewalk is wet then it rained last night, where our Q here is the sidewalk is wet and P is yes, it rained last night. So let us proceed with the contrapositive of the conditional statement. So our contrapositive is if not Q then not P. So our statement here is if the sidewalk is not wet then it did not rain last night. What is our Q here? Yes, the sidewalk is not wet. And P? Yes, it did not rain last night. So let us proceed with the inverse. So our inverse is if not P, then not Q. So what is our statement here? Yes, if it did not rain last night, then the sidewalk is not wet. Where P here is it did not rain last night and Q, the sidewalk is not wet.
Thank you, Miss Glyza. Given an if and then statement, if P then Q, we can identify three related statements. A conditional statement consists of two parts: a hypothesis in the if clause and a conclusion in the then clause. For instance, if it rains, then they cancel school. Now, our hypothesis is it rains and our conclusion is they cancel school. Our goal is that we will transform the conditional statement into its related three statements. To form the converse of the conditional statement, interchange the hypothesis and the conclusion. The converse of the given conditional statement is if they cancel school, then it rains. To form the inverse of the conditional statement, take the negation of both the hypothesis and the conclusion. The inverse of the given conditional statement is if it does not rain, then they do not cancel school. To form the contrapositive of the conditional statement, interchange the hypothesis and the conclusion of the inverse statement. The contrapositive of the given conditional statement is if they do not cancel school, then it does not rain. For you to be able to better understand the concept of inverse, converse, and contrapositive in an if and then statement, I will show you a table that distinguishes the three related statements. The conditional statement consists of the hypothesis and the conclusion, denoted as if P then Q. However, If we transform the conditional statement into its converse form, then the hypothesis and the conclusion will be interchanged, denoted as if Q, then P. While if we transform the conditional statement into its inverse form, then we will negate the hypothesis and the conclusion, denoted as if not P, then not Q. On the other hand, if we will write the conditional statement into its contrapositive form, we will interchange the hypothesis and the conclusion and negate them, denoted as if not Q, then not P. If the statement is true, then the contrapositive is also logically true. If the converse is true, then the inverse is also logically true. So our example is, if two angles are congruent, then they have the same measure. So this is our conditional statement. If we analyze this given conditional statement, what do you think? It is true or false? Yes, you are correct. This statement is true because if two angles are congruent, basically they have the same measurement. Now that we are already analyzed the given condition and it provides a true statement, we will move to the related statements. First, it's converse. If two angles have the same measure, then they are congruent. This statement is logically true because if we have given an angles that have the same measure, then we consider that two angles are congruent. Second, the inverse. If two angles are not congruent, then they do not have the same measure. This statement is also logically true because if the given two angles are not congruent, then they have not the same measure. Therefore, this statement is true. Lastly, contrapositive form. If two angles do not have the same measure, then they are not congruent. This statement is logically true because if two angles are not the same measure, then they are not congruent. And now, it is your turn to answer this activity. All you need to do is to write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of each statement. Number 1. If a person lives in Davao City, then that person lives in the Philippines. Number 2. If a person speaks French, then that person is from France. Number 3. If a person is a student, then he or she wears a school uniform. Number 4. If x squared minus 1, then x equals 10. And number 5. If the coordinates of a point are both positive, then the point is in the first quadrant. That's all for today. Thank you for watching, and we hope that you learn for today's discussion.